Welcome back to Life After Trauma. I'm your host, Jess, a certified trauma informed life coach. If you're new to the podcast, we bring women from around the world together through conversations that will empower, support, and inspire you on your healing journey. This week on the podcast, we have Lisa Sugarman, author, a 3-time survivor of suicide loss, and a crisis counselor with the Trevor Project, which is an organization for suicide prevention. Today, Lisa and I will be discussing suicide and prevention resources for those struggling and loved ones who've been impacted. We'll also be talking about grief and why it's important to sit in your grief instead of repressing it. Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for being here today. Can we start with you sharing your story?
Yeah, of course. So my story is a little bit unique in the sense that I mean, you mentioned it. I'm a survivor, 3-time survivor of suicide loss. And one of the biggest, most profound losses in that group of three was my father, who I lost when I was 10 years old. But the twist that my story takes is that I didn't learn that my father had died by suicide until I was 45 years old. So I learned that truth 35 years after he passed away. The narrative that I was given at the time when I was 10 is that he had died of a heart attack.
Yeah.
And it was in that moment what my mother felt she needed to do to protect me from, more pain than the pain I was already going through, just having lost him. So as a result of that loss and another loss of a close family friend, we grew up together, we lived together out of college, and he passed away and took his life 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago. So it's been a lot of time in that kind of grief, and a lot of lived experience, and a lot of kind of shattering and putting pieces back together. And you kind of touched on a little bit of the work that I do in the world now because of that. And you and I were talking before in the green room about how much my focus and the work I do has changed so much in the past couple of years because I started sharing my story. And
Yeah.
it has led me to people like you and platforms like this to be able to continue to try and change this narrative on suicide.
Yeah, it's such important work that you're doing, honestly. Like we had mentioned before, it's a topic that not a lot of people talk about.
Yeah.
And I think that it affects more people than we realize.
Mm.
And it's so important what you're doing, sharing your story and all of the resources that you've compiled. And yeah. What were you feeling when you found out the truth about your dad's death?
I mean, you have to understand, just for context, that it was completely by accident. I was never supposed to find out.
Mm,
So my mother had kind of made that decision in that moment to both tell me that it was a heart attack and to keep the secret of the suicide. And really, I found out because I had a very unexpected conversation with a cousin just in passing. It was like a totally lighthearted, we were catching up, hadn't seen each other for a long time. And she was asking about my kids, and one thing led to another. And kind of out of the blue, she asked me if my father actually asked if my kids had had any of the same mental illness that my father had. And
oh,
I had no idea what she was talking about. I had no idea what she was referring to because I was
mhm.
unaware of any mental illness. My mother was unaware of any mental illness. And in that moment, I was puzzled by it, but didn't really, how sometimes somebody catches you off guard and it's just out of context and you just aren't prepared to really dive into it. So you just kind of let it sit, and I let it
Yeah.
sit, and I didn't really react to it. And it was shortly after that conversation, I was with my mom, and I didn't go running to my mom to
Mm,
say, what's going on? What do I not know? But in another conversation with her, it kind of came out. And without really even anticipating having this conversation, I asked if my dad had been depressed, and she said yes. And before I knew what I was saying or why I was even saying it, I asked if he had taken his life, and she said yes.
hmm.
And that just, it was, to answer your question, it was just the most surreal and impossible moment of my life. I mean, you'd have to know my dad to have known that he was just this beautiful, kind, loving, even keeled man. He was a family man. He was the hardest working guy I knew. He was funny, and he was just the greatest guy I knew.
Mhm.
And for him to have been suffering like that and
Yeah.
suffering silently like that was like, it was just, it didn't compute. It just was
Yeah.
impossible. But it was the truth. And we just, it just kind of tore me all the way down to the studs. And, I continue to build myself back up. I'm doing that 10 years later, 10 years after finding this out, I'm still doing that. And we'll always continue to do that. But, now I know obviously the truth. And um, now it's, what do I do with it? What do I do with that
Yeah.
truth? How do I make that worth something? And so that's why I'm having these conversations. That's why I'm out advocating in crisis counseling. I want to be the person on the other end of the phone now when someone calls and they're in crisis, or I want to have the resources when someone's struggling. So,
Yeah.
um, you know, that's where I'm.
Yeah. Any loss is a hard loss. I have not lost anybody to suicide, but I have to imagine that that just cuts even deeper than a
Yeah,
regular loss.
it's, you don't want to minimize any kind of loss. You said it yourself. A loss is tragic and so heartbreaking,
Mhm.
and stays with you forever, and you're always
Yeah.
grieving. There are little nuances, so many little nuances about a suicide loss that are just, they just don't exist. If someone dies of a heart attack, or someone has cancer, and those are tragic and terrible things, but there's no stigma attached to that. There's no questioning attached to that. There's no second guessing yourself and what did I miss, or what could I have said or done. Those elements just don't exist. So it's just a very unique kind of grief to deal with. And each one, I mean, I've dealt with three of them now, and each one is so different. They're so,
Mm.
so different. In some cases we knew someone was struggling, and in some cases we didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I listened to a podcast interview that you did, the wellness podcast.
Wellness podcast,
Yeah.
sure. Hmm.
And there was a part in there that you had said that really got me, and it was so it was the day that your dad passed,
Hmm.
and you were coming home on the school bus,
Mm.
and your mom came out and walked you down the street to, I think you said, your aunt's car.
Yeah.
And you had said in this interview, you had said it made no sense for me to think this, but I was immediately like, where's dad?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's funny, certain moments of your life you remember, like when I'm hearing you, it's not often that I hear someone recalling that to me. Like, that's my memory. I'm usually the one sharing it. So it's a
yeah,
very unique experience right now to hear you say it to me. And I so appreciate you taking the time to listen to that. But in that moment, I remember it like it was this morning. And there was no reason at that time of day. My father worked, I lived, we were just outside of Boston, and my father worked in the city every day. So he would never have been home to get me off the bus. That was just not a thing that
right.
happened. It was always much later. And so there was no reason for me to ask. And it's so interesting the way our instincts lead us in
Yeah.
certain ways. And yeah, it was, well, and I'm not sure if I mentioned it in that interview that you listened to, but in that moment of getting off the bus and seeing my mother, my house was directly in front of where the bus was parked. And I could see a line of cars in front of my
Hmm.
house. And
Hmm.
I knew that was my Uncle Milton's car. That was my grandmother's car. That was my Aunt Harriet's car. Everyone's cars were there. It was 2 weeks after my 10th birthday. And in that split second, I was convinced they were having a surprise party for me for my birthday. And she scooped me up and walked me over to my aunt's car and
Yeah.
told me the worst thing I'd ever heard in my life.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't, like, I honestly can't imagine. But yeah, when I heard you say that, I wrote down in my notebook, I was like, how interesting is it that like we just instinctually know when
Hmm.
something is off, when something's wrong.
Yeah.
I found that really interesting. Shifting away a little bit from your story, your page, I noticed that you had a comment on there saying that we should stop saying committed suicide. And I'm curious what the reasoning is and what terminology should we use instead?
Well, it's actually, I really appreciate you bringing that up because it's become a big shift within the mental health space to really focus very intentionally on language. And when you think about how we've always classified a death by suicide, we say committed suicide. Like everybody says
Mhm.
committed suicide. We're all trained and hardwired to think of it that way because that's how it originated. And yet, when you kind of deconstruct that, people have begun to realize that when you think about the word committed, if you just kind of take that out and
Mhm.
isolate it, what do you think of? Like, what do you think of? You think of committed a crime, or you say you've
Mm.
committed some kind of a sin, or something, you committed an immoral act. Like, when you're using the
Mhm.
word committed in that kind of context, it it kind of insinuates that it's a negative.
Mm.
The connotation is that it's wrong or it's bad or it's unlawful in some way. And so when then you attach it to a suicide, now all of a sudden the person who has died by suicide
Mm.
is now like automatically stigmatized. They're automatically
Mhm.
stigmatized as having done something bad or wrong or immoral. And then it really doesn't do that person justice. So there's been this movement within the mental health industry and community where people are saying, no, 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 like words matter a lot. And so we need to stop saying committed suicide because it gives the wrong impression. And
Right.
it unfairly stigmatizes the person who now can't defend themselves or their actions. And oh, by the way, dying by suicide is, it may be against religious beliefs in some cases or against the law in other cases. It's actually none of those things. It's the product of an illness, and it's as simple as that. It's complicated, obviously, but it's as simple as that in reality. And you would never want to blame someone for making that decision that they felt they had to make because there was no other way. So that's why we're moving away from that. And instead, we say something like, a lot of people are saying suicided now, like they
Okay.
suicided, which I don't say myself as often, but I'm hearing it more and more. People say died by suicide or took their life or
Mm.
ended their life.
Mhm.
That's what people are saying now instead. And it just gives that person dignity
Yeah.
in a way that they deserve.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly would not have thought about that. So I'm
Mm.
really happy that you had that on your page and that we could have that conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to talk a bit about the loved ones of people
Mm.
struggling with suicidal ideation. So I had mentioned that I have a couple of stories. So I'm just going to share them if that's okay with you. So in my teens, I had two friends from different social circles that both attempted to take their life at separate times. Thankfully, they both called me before it was too late. But in both cases, they had already swallowed a bottle of pills before they called.
Okay.
And the first friend that this happened with, I didn't fully understand the severity of what was happening. I was 16 and she called me and asked me to pick her up. So I went and got her and brought her back to my place where I lived with my mom. My mom had gone out to visit a friend. I remember my friend saying that she was just really tired and she just wanted to sleep. So I brought her upstairs to my mom's bed because that was the closest one. My room
Mm.
was like farther down the hall and I was practically carrying her.
Yeah.
Um, so I called my mom and told her what was happening, and she told me to call 911. And I went upstairs to check on my friend. I like shook her awake and told her that I was calling an ambulance. And she told me no. And I insisted. She told me that she would hate me for the rest of her life. And, as an adult, maybe that wouldn't have such a big impact hearing that, but I was
Mm.
16 and I was like, wow, she's my best friend. Like, I don't want to lose my best friend. So I made the decision in that moment that I would rather her be alive and hate
Yeah.
me for the
Yeah.
rest of her life than her to die. I called the ambulance. They asked me to check if she was still breathing. And I'm standing there in the dark room. I honestly had no idea. Like, I couldn't see her body moving at all, not a sound coming from her. My heart's like pounding, my hands are shaking. Uh, yeah, like literally just so scared. I reached out to try and feel a pulse and I couldn't even find that. And I wasn't sure if it was just that I wasn't in the right place,
Yeah,
you
sure.
know?
Yeah.
So the paramedics came and rushed us to the hospital where they pumped her stomach and
Hmm.
whatever else it is that they do.
Hmm.
But the doctor came out after and told me that if she had gotten there even 10 minutes later, that she would not have made it.
Mm. That's
Um,
heavy. That's just I'm just picturing you being 16 years old and not equipped to have an experience like that, and how incredibly traumatizing. I mean, thankfully
yeah.
you did all the right things and you saved her life. And as traumatic as it was for you, that this person is living now because of you and what you did. So
Yeah.
it's what a beautiful thing.
I think that was the biggest thing is that, like, I didn't know that I was making all the right choices, but
Mm,
at the end of the day, it's like, okay, but she's alive.
yeah.
So,
Yeah. And we talked a little bit a while ago about instinct
yeah. Yeah.
and how they sometimes just kick in and take us where we need to go.
Yeah, for sure. The second friend, she had attempted multiple times and we had always gotten her to the hospital on time. But after the third attempt and the third call from her telling me that she had taken the pills, I was just emotionally exhausted. And even as an 18-year-old kid, I
Hmm.
knew she needed more serious intervention and
Yeah.
help. Nothing that I could provide. So I arranged with the psychiatric hospital for her to be held. And like going through my head was just, what if one of these times I can't answer her call?
Yeah.
Or like I can't be there for some reason. I still remember driving her to the hospital and we walked into the intake center and they had told me before that, like, I should leave while she was talking to the desk. So I slipped away past the locked door when she realized what was happening. Like she couldn't get out because the door was one of yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she was just standing there pounding on the door and screaming and crying and like it literally took every ounce of strength in me to turn around and walk away. Obviously, like tears just like pouring down my face. But I share these stories to just show some of the really challenging decisions that
Hmm.
need to be made by loved ones.
Hmm.
And like I said before, I'm not certain that the choices I made were the absolute best choice, but they're both alive. Um,
So I guess they were. I
yeah,
guess they were the right choices.
yeah.
We're not
So,
supposed to have all the answers. That's the thing that
yeah,
I think people have to remember. And when you're in a situation like you've been in now twice, you have to be the one. I know you're trying to be the one to help, but as that person who's trying to help, you need help.
yeah,
And you need to know where to turn and what to do. And that's another huge reason why people like you and I and others have to keep having these conversations, because eventually these conversations will land on the people who eventually will themselves be in the situation and
yeah,
recall, okay, well, I heard this podcast and they said that the 988 number, that's a number we can call, or the Trevor Project, that's a number we can call.
yeah.
So the more conversations we have where we bring all these aspects and dimensions of this to light, like the more people we reach.
Yeah, exactly. And that was going to be my question to you. If somebody
Mm.
out there has a loved one that they're worried about,
Hmm.
what is the best thing that they can do for them?
The very best thing to do for them is to be there for them, is to hold space for them. And that doesn't require as much action as people think. People get
Mhm.
very intimidated. Like everybody wants to be there to help. Everybody wants to ask the question, are you okay? But people are really afraid of the answer that they're going to get. And in your case, you had to go through the motions of getting your friend into a treatment facility. Like that's a lot. That's a
Mhm.
lot. And it won't necessarily be that kind of help in every situation. In your case it was. For someone else, the first and most important thing is to ask, are you okay? And if you
Yeah.
think that that person is suicidal or has done something to try and end their life or harm themselves, you need to be direct. And I'm talking now to the people who are listening to you and I talk. You have to ask a very direct, very blunt, kind of scary question, which is, are you thinking of killing yourself? And I know anybody listening to this is probably like, oh, hell no, I can't. Are you kidding? I can't ask that. You have to ask that. And you have to ask it exactly the way I said it. You have to say, are you thinking of harming yourself or killing yourself? And as scary as that seems, the reason why we're direct like that is because it immediately sends a message to that person who's struggling. Okay, that person's taking me seriously. They
Mm.
know that I'm really struggling. They know that I'm not okay. And it says that I'm a safe space. It
Okay.
proves that I'm someone who is there. I'm not taking it lightly. I'm in it. I want to help. I'm present. And that's the way to lead with a conversation like that, is to ask
Mm.
that question first. Now then, who knows what kind of an answer you're going to get. I am okay, or I'm not okay, or I'm sort of okay, or I did try to harm myself. The best advice I can ever give to anybody, and I'm speaking now as someone who takes these calls on crisis lines all the time, daily, remember the 988 crisis and suicide hotline number. It's 3 digits. Put it in your phone, keep it on your brain, pass it around, put it on your fridge. The 988 number is a number that anybody can call. And it's not just for someone who is suicidal or someone who is homicidal or someone who is harming themselves. Maybe you've gone through a terrible life event, like you've gotten divorced or you've lost a loved one or you have lost a job or a home or you're homeless or you're being abused, or anything that constitutes a mental crisis.
Mm.
That's why you should get in touch with an organization like the 988 crisis lifeline, and they are the ones who will help you. Now you can either have the person who's struggling call them directly, or you can do something that's called a third party call, which we get all the time, which is, like, for instance, if I had a friend who was struggling and they just did not have the capacity to call, but
Yeah.
they said, okay, yeah, can you be with me? Can you talk to them?
Yeah.
Sure. You get on the phone and you say, hey, listen, I'm here. I'm with my friend. My friend is in crisis. How do we navigate this? And then that call will kind of take place. You'll be kind of the conduit in that call. And
Mm.
it will be a third party call where you're kind of involved in that call. And hopefully eventually your friend will be, the friend will be able to take the phone call
Right.
themselves. So, those are the things. Like if you think someone is attempting right now, you call 988. And or you call, actually, if you think it's an attempt, you call 911.
Right.
If they're struggling, you call 988.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's in the States, right?
That is in the United States. Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
but there is a directory. I have almost a complete directory. It's a work in progress on my website. One of the things that I have is a resource hub, and part of that hub, I've tried to accumulate all the numbers for all of the countries. I think out of 175, I think I probably have
Wow.
120 or 125. So, yes, 988 is for this country. And then I do have access to others if you go to my website.
Yeah, I will leave that linked in the show notes for everybody
That's
to
great.
access. Yeah.
Great.
Um, so there was a stat that you had mentioned
Mm-hmm.
in the other podcast,
Mm-hmm.
and it was about the difference that one person listening to
Mhm.
someone can make. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Sure, sure. So I believe the one that you're talking about comes from the Trevor Project, where I volunteer. So I'm a lifeline counselor. I take calls from people who are struggling. And for those who don't know, I know you said that they were a crisis and support hotline. What people may not know is that the Trevor Project, their main demographic is the LGBTQ community, youth in particular, ages 13 to 24. We obviously will answer calls from anyone who may call, even if they're out of our demographic, of course, but our primary audience is LGBTQ youth. So the statistic refers to LGBTQ youth who are in crisis. And one person, having one singular person to connect to when you're in crisis reduces the risk of someone's suicide by over 40%. It's just one human being.
Wow,
It almost cuts the likelihood of suicide in half.
that's huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a pretty wild statistic when you really look at it. And that's just one person holding space or one person being a support system, and the impact that that can make is literally life-changing. Yeah, it's a pretty
Can
incredible fact.
That is. I know we did discuss already question that you can ask and holding space, but I'm
Hmm.
wondering if maybe we can even just go a little bit deeper into for somebody who is hearing, okay, I need to hold space, but they're like, how do I do
How do
this?
I do that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, holding space, some people might say there's an art to it. Some people might say there isn't at all. It's really just taking in whatever the person in crisis is saying and validating that. It doesn't matter if you believe it or not, if you think they're being dramatic or not, if you think that they're, somehow exaggerating or not, if you don't believe it doesn't matter any of it. Take that completely out of the equation. When you're holding space for someone, you want to be non-judgmental, you want to be kind. You want to ask open ended questions. Don't ask yes or no questions, because when we do that, the person shuts down. They give you a yes or a no, and the conversation stops. Ask open ended questions that are going to create a dialogue so that you'll get more information about like how they're feeling, what they're thinking. Do they have any plans in place, to do anything to themselves or to someone else? So that's what holding space really means. I mean, it can be as simple as just like sitting on the other end of the phone or sitting across a table and just listening to somebody talk, or being there when somebody's crying, put your arms around them. You get a good sense if someone's coming to you to hold space and is looking to you for that. You're going to know if that's the kind of person who can benefit from just like wrap your arms around that person and just say, I'm here for it, I'm here for you, like let's figure it out together, I know you're struggling. It's incredible the power that validation has, because I don't have to tell you, you understand, and most people listening will understand that mental illness, and something like depression in particular, can distort your sense of reality to such an extreme degree that you think you're losing your mind, and you don't think anybody understands where you're at or what you're struggling with. And it can get people to such a deep and dark, hopeless place. And just having someone there saying like, I hear you, I hear
Mhm.
it, I can hear it in your voice, I can see you're upset, what would be helpful right now?
Mhm.
Can I sit with you? Can I stay with you? Do you want to go for a walk? Like, somebody who's already that stressed doesn't necessarily want to be thinking, you don't want to necessarily ask them, what can I do for you? It's more like, okay, in this moment, you think of something. Say like, let's go for a ride. Let's go for a walk. Let's go get a coffee. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Maybe even just those micro acts of, you know, normalcy can make that
Right.
person, can de-escalate that person, make them feel a little less stressed.
Right. So if I had a loved one who I feel like they're struggling, but they have not expressed anything.
Mhm.
How would you approach that conversation?
I mean, I don't think I would necessarily be as direct and say, "Are you thinking of harming yourself?" I mean, if you have a sense, if you know that person and maybe that person's behavior has changed, maybe they're not reaching out as much, maybe you're seeing signs and signals that something's just off. I mean, I would just ask. I'd be like, "Are you okay? Like, are you,
Mm,
can you want to take a walk? Do you want to go for a drive? Let's, do you want to hang out a little bit, go for dinner?" And have the conversation and just say, "I might be wrong, but I'm getting a sense
mm,
that maybe you're not okay. And I want you to know that if you're not okay, like, I want to be there to help you through it. I want to be there to hear what's happening and what's in your headspace and what do you need right now." So I mean, I
yeah,
think I think the best that any of us can ever do is just like show up authentically, show up in a
yeah,
way that reinforces that you're a safe place to be and that you're there for it and you want to do whatever you can to help. And then, at the end of the day, it's like you can't force someone who's not ready to disclose that, what's going on. You can't force that.
yeah.
And it's hard. I mean, there are two very different cohorts of people. My dad was in one, and for instance, my cousin was in another, where with my father, you had no idea. You have the people who
Mm,
like walk around the world like they are just the happiest, most balanced and relaxed and joyful people, and they're a shell on the inside. That was my dad. And then my cousin had always struggled and had been in therapy and did have a lot of known issues. So it's real tough when it's somebody that you can't see it. When it's invisible like that, it's hard to know what to do. Or it's hard to even know that it's there.
yeah, for sure. I have another question for you.
Mm.
I'm wondering when somebody comes to us and they need us to hold space,
Mhm.
but we don't have the capacity to do that. Do you have any advice for if that situation comes up for someone?
I think that's a great scenario to talk about because I feel like that kind of a situation is likely to come up at some point. Like, we don't have an unlimited amount of capacity.
Yeah.
There's that whole saying, whenever you say yes to someone else, you're saying no to yourself. And I mean, the whole issue of boundaries, like I'm 56 years old and I feel like I just finally have gotten the hang of establishing and maintaining boundaries in my life. I think it's, first of all, whatever your capacity is, like, you can't take care of someone else if you're not taking care of yourself. And it is not selfish for you to say, I am not in a place where I can show up for you in the way that I know that you need
Exactly.
someone. And I will help you to maybe find someone. Let me make sure that you have someone. That's where something like the 988 Crisis Lifeline or the Trevor
Mm,
Project comes into play, because what you can say is, "I think what you're going through may be beyond my capacity to help." And there are ways that you can kind of wordsmith it a little bit where you're not necessarily saying, I don't have the bandwidth right now, the emotional bandwidth, because if you're not sure how that person, if that'll offend that person,
yeah.
maybe you don't say it like that. Maybe instead you choose to say, "I don't know if I have the ability to help you right now, so
Yeah.
let me find someone who can. Here's a place to start. Here's, like, do you have a therapist?" I would always check in with someone and say, "Hey, I know it's a personal question, but are you working with a therapist, and is that
Mm,
someone that you can contact?" And if it's a no, then that's when you would immediately defer to the 988 line.
yeah.
Um, Absolutely. And most communities, cities, states have their own, like Massachusetts, where I am, has like the Massachusetts Behavioral Health Line that you can call. And if you are a resident of Massachusetts, they
Mhm.
can even go out and bring a clinician to your house. They can help you on a much more clinical level than even the 988 line
Oh,
can. And a lot of states have that. Someone could call 222, and that number is almost like a directory of resources that are available. It's more like a directory than a hotline. So, there is always somewhere to turn, even when you
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily have, and you and I talked about this earlier, like a spouse or a partner or a community or like a safety net of people. There are these organizations, and we need to get people comfortable knowing that those resources are there. Like
Yeah.
none of us would ever think twice if our house caught on fire,
Mm-hmm.
or there was a burglary, or there was or there was something, you would call 911
Mm-hmm.
immediately. Everybody
Mm-hmm.
knows. What we need to do is create the same understanding around the 988 lifeline. Like, oh, everybody just it's automatic. You call 988 if you're struggling emotionally.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really good point because I could see somebody maybe feeling scared to call or
Hmm.
uncomfortable to call. So, yeah, I guess just like bringing more awareness and
Hmm.
bringing down the stigma, let's tear
Hmm.
that down.
Yeah, and look, you and I are doing it right now, and that's why I
Yeah.
love these conversations so much, because we're doing it unapologetically. We're doing it from a place of genuine love and concern for anybody who may be
Yeah.
listening to this, or anybody who may be struggling. And the more we talk about it, the more we do it in a way that normalizes it. It just becomes another thing that we talk about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So let's shift gears here a little bit
Mm.
and let's talk about the grief side of things. And can you talk about why it's important for us to sit in our grief rather than repress it?
I talk a lot about sitting in grief because I think it's something that people are just afraid of. Grief is such an unwieldy, scary, traumatic thing to have to go through. And so I think everybody's natural instinct is like, if we lose someone we love, we know the grief is attached to that loss. And everybody just wants to kind of get through it, get through it, get through it as fast as you can. Well, I don't want to, you know, I don't want to bust any myths here, but I do, because grief doesn't ever stop. It just changes, it evolves, it's fluid. And we can't rush it. We can't sidestep it, can't bury it. I mean, it's there. The way, like the path of least resistance, right? It's forward. And when
Mhm.
we realize that it's a part of life, like, you know, grief is just another expression of love. And I know it's
Mm.
really impossible to think that way when you're in the midst of terrible grief, because it's so all consuming. But when you realize that the reason why you're grieving is because you cared about this person
Yeah.
so much, that I don't know, there's some kind of strange comfort in that.
Mm.
And what I can say about sitting in it is that when you do kind of you attack it head on, or you at least acknowledge it head on, it becomes less scary because you take the power away from grief. It's kind of like you take the power away from the stigma of suicide. If we're all like hush hush and we don't say the word suicide and we never talk about mental illness, then when we do, it's like this big scary thing. But when we do talk about it, it's like what happens when you challenge a bully, they back down. Well, when you
Mm.
challenge something like the stigma of suicide, or when you challenge grief, then all of a sudden you've got the power. You
Yeah.
get to do it on your terms. And if you're like, okay, I feel like shit right now, and I'm miserable and I'm overcome, I don't want to do anything. I don't want to see anyone. Okay, so be that. Be
Mhm.
that for
Mhm.
as long as you need to be that. And the duration is what the duration is. It's going to be what it's going to be. But we get through it a lot faster when we allow ourselves to feel those feelings, because now we're processing them. Now we're accepting them to some degree. And we're always going to grieve, but we won't always feel the way that we feel
Yeah.
in that moment of intensity.
Yeah. There was a way that you worded it in the last episode that I thought was beautiful. You said it was weaving that loss into your life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so true. Like that the loss will never go away. The
Mm-hmm.
grief will never go away when you lose somebody that you loved. And it is a matter of it becomes part of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And You learn how to live with it, you learn how to deal with it. Talking about the repression part, I don't know, have you ever read the book, The Untethered Soul?
I have not.
Okay, so I love that book, and they have a whole chapter in there on triggers, and
Hmm.
it's similar, a little different. They're not talking about it in the form of grief, but it made me think of it because it's so true. If we don't actually feel the feeling that we have, we repress it, then
Hmm.
it's just going to keep coming back up.
Yeah.
Then like we will have things that they used the example of like a thorn. So it's like when you suppress or repress your emotions, you have a thorn in you. And
Mm.
if somebody says something or you see something and it pushes on the
Yeah.
edge of that
Yeah.
thorn and
Yeah.
it hurts.
Mm.
And unless you can actually feel those feelings and like you're saying, sit in that feeling,
Hmm.
then it's never gonna become less painful.
No, it won't until we process it. And the
Yeah.
human mind and the human heart has to kind of run through all these feelings before we kind of process them and assimilate them, and then that weaving of grief just becomes a coexistence. We learn how to coexist with those feelings. Look, I my dad's been gone for 46 years. And there are days when it feels like 406, and there are days when it feels like he kissed me goodnight last night. And I still get grief attacks. I'm a
Mhm.
big lover of the outdoors and mountaineering, and my father was a huge mountaineer, and that's where I got that love of nature from. Whenever I am up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, which was our place, and I'm
Mm.
climbing in the White Mountains. It doesn't matter how I am joyful. Like that is my place. That's where I love to be. It's where I feel most connected to the world and to my father. But yet, inevitably, every single time I'm in that place, it triggers something, and it makes me feel
Mhm.
like I'm 10 years old again, and he just passed away. So we have to just kind of allow ourselves to stay open
Yeah.
in some way. Like the door's always kind of cracked open, you know what I mean? The door to the soul, I think, and the door to those emotions, just enough so that the stuff that needs to come and go can come and
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. I feel like living life with an open heart is the way that you can truly experience everything that life has to offer. When
Hmm.
we're scared to feel something, then we shut ourselves down. And everything comes as a positive and negative, or like they have the opposites, right? So if you're gonna be afraid to lose something or to feel that loss, then you're never really gonna feel the joy or the love that comes before that.
That's right. That's right. It's a beautiful way of saying it, and it's true. It's true. Like
Yeah.
we have, I mean, I don't want to oversimplify, but we have to feel all the feels.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts or words of advice, anything you want to share?
I think I would just say the same thing that I lead with most of the time. It's just meet yourself where you are, wherever it is. And that is kind of like a shout out to sitting in the grief or sitting in the loss or, sitting in the trauma, whatever it is. Just like meet yourself where you are, because you can't go back and you can't really go forward. You just kind of have to be where you are. And I would say, don't be afraid to reach out when you need help. Like that's the thing. We're all taught, especially in this Western culture, like soldier on, keep going, move forward, suck it up, keep going. And that's absolute bullshit. We shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be teaching our kids to do that. We have to acknowledge that, we are all perfectly imperfect on our very best at days. You know what I mean? And that the good comes with the bad, and we have to let ourselves take that in, but we have to also learn how to reach out for help when the days aren't so good.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm.
I think that's so important. I think you said it before, it's knowing that you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
There's always going to be somebody there. If it's not a support person that you know personally,
Mm-hmm.
then it's a support from an organization, but somebody will always be there
Mm.
to talk to you if you need it and to support you. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's a key message is that you're not alone.
Right. You're not alone, and there are resources. There are so many resources out there in the world for so many varieties of communities and people. And I mean, you and I talked a little bit early on before you recorded about one of the projects that I've worked on for a while in terms of resources is to accumulate a resource hub, a mental health resources hub that has, a toolkit component to it as well. And I've done that on my website. It's a free directory. It's gotten pretty big. There are hundreds and hundreds of organizations, all broken down into different categories for the BIPOC community, the LGBTQ community, and veterans, and the elderly, and AAPI, and there are. Trust me when I say there are resources out there for anyone in any community, in any situation, going through any kind of crisis. So I know you are so kind to say that you would put links to all of that in the show notes. Please, if you're listening to this and you're looking for resources for you or someone that you care about, go there. Go to my website, take a look at it, bookmark it, share it, and just make sure that you remember that help is out there.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for the work that you do and for coming on today to talk to us and share all of this great information and knowledge.
Oh, that's my absolute pleasure. And thank you for just having a safe space like this to do that, because we need more of these. We need so many more of these. And this is definitely a wonderful one. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.